wasn't diagnosed. And now, you know, I think we still have elements of that, but we're having pockets of people at times being diagnosed, you know, who may not meet the criteria. And so it's always worth sort of going back and recalling what it is that we're talking about. So this is a form of orthostatic intolerance. So it's a syndrome where people feel unwell on standing. The symptoms often relate, we think, to cerebral hypoperfusion, not enough blood to parts of the brain, to sympathetic activation, to revved up sympathetic nervous system. And one of the keys of orthostatic intolerance is that these symptoms are positional. These are symptoms that are worse when you're upright and get better. They don't have to get completely better, but they should get better fairly quickly on lying down, a lot of them anyway. And in addition to the symptoms, the syndrome part, there needs to be orthostatic tachycardia, right? So it's normal for people for their heart rate to go up on standing. It's part of our adaptation to being upright, to being bipeds from quadrupeds. It is an important physiologic response in the autonomic nervous system. So we're not talking about something that's fundamentally abnormal. What's abnormal is the excessiveness of the response. A 15-beat increase in heart rate from lying to standing, perfectly normal. A 50-beat increase, maybe not so much. And so the cut point that was defined by Phil Lowe has been 30. It's what's commonly used. The limitation of this cut point is that orthostatic tachycardia, the physiologic orthostatic tachycardia, changes with age. Physiologic orthostatic tachycardia, what is normal, is much higher in someone very young and decreases as we get older. And so in a child, a heart rate increase of even 50 beats a minute may be perfectly normal in a healthy child. A heart rate increase of 30 beats a minute in someone in their 60s and 70s is probably much more abnormal than a heart rate increase of 30 beats per minute in someone at the age of 30. And so we don't have criteria that define that, but that needs to be kept in mind when thinking about the criteria. But one of the key issues that has come up is that there are a lot of teenagers, for example, that suffer from similar symptoms and have been diagnosed with postural tachycardia syndrome. And so primarily the group at Mayo actually went and looked at this fairly carefully in school-aged children and found that the orthostatic tachycardia was higher in healthy folks, and so redefined the criteria in kids to require an increase of 40 beats per minute. Again, it makes a difference if you're 12 or if you're 19, but for simplicity, we've picked a number. If we make it too complicated, no one will be able to use it. And then the other key thing to keep in mind is that this is a chronic disorder. So if someone were to get acutely unwell, if someone were to develop the flu, and certainly around where I am, there's a lot of that going around, part of the physiologic response may well include orthostatic tachycardia. A lot of people may well have symptoms that are worse when they're upright and may have symptoms similar to a POTS patient. The key difference is that these patients will usually get better within a day or two. At least greatly, these symptoms will decrease, while in a patient with postural tachycardia syndrome, it doesn't go away. It persists, and it persists for very long periods of time. And so we have an element of chronicity, and people can quibble over whether 3 months is enough or 6 months is required. But the point is, it's not a week or 2 weeks. It's not a couple of days. It's actually a chronic disorder. So who's affected? It's primarily women and women of childbearing age. The numbers thrown out here are 13 to 50, but these are ballpark figures. There are certainly kids under 13 who have been described as having POTS, and can certainly happen above the age of 50, but the common age group affected are sort of young teenager and young adult females, right? So very much the childbearing age demographic. The percentage of female to male varies a little from study to study, and in several of the studies we've done and others have published, the rates of female enrollees are actually over 90%, but the truth is probably somewhere in this range of 4 or 5 to 1 female to male. The exact number as to how many are affected is very difficult to ascertain. And the reason is because there isn't good data looking at it. So if I wanted to know how many people in the United States had a myocardial infarction or a heart attack last year, we could actually go to administrative databases kept by Medicare, kept by other groups, organizations in the government and hospital organizations. And based on the way they've coded for billing purposes, we could get fairly precise estimates of how many heart attacks there were. And then we could track that from year to year, saying there's more, there's less, we're doing better, we're not, we need to work on this. But there's no code for POTS. Even at Vanderbilt, when I was there, and several colleagues that would see patients with POTS in our autonomic clinic, I suspect we all used different codes. I used a tachycardia code, other people might use a dysautonomia code. I know some people use an orthostatic hypotension code, even though we say you can't have orthostatic hypotension in POTS, because the purpose of the coding is to put something down so that you can categorize the visit and get paid for the visit and then leave. And quite frankly, I didn't enjoy dealing with coders or billing people. My goal when I coded was to put something down where people wouldn't get mad at me and make me spend more time working on it. So the reality is it's hard to get precise estimates, and the estimates really are based on people's gestalts, based on people's perceptions of how busy their clinics are, and are based on groups like Dysautonomia International, who have broad outreach to the patient community and can get a sense of is this rare or not. And the sense is that overall POTS probably isn't rare, certainly by the NIH definition of a rare disorder. The estimates have been thrown around, vary a fair bit, but range right now from about 500,000 to about 3 million people in the United States. But these really are very rough estimates. One of the hallmarks of POTS is that it's associated with quite significant functional disability. And we touch on that a little. I'm happy to go into that more afterwards. But it's not just that people are diagnosed with a condition. It's that people, in this critical, late teens, finishing schooling, starting adult life phase, actually can get quite debilitated by this disorder and its related manifestations. So there's been a reasonable amount of work and publications on POTS. There are a handful of centers that have been interested in this disorder for several years now. I was at Vanderbilt. I was certainly at one of those centers. And a lot of the work we did at Vanderbilt was very physiologically based, right? So we were trying to understand what is the fundamental problem? What's causing this person to have POTS while this other person doesn't? Trying to figure out the pathophysiology. And the idea is that could help us, and I think at times has helped us to develop more rational treatments. It sometimes helps if you can sort of get it, pathophysiologic mechanism, it helps in terms of targeting that mechanism in terms with the drugs, as opposed to using drugs without that knowledge. So I think there's value in that. I don't want anything I say from here on in to be construed as that's bad. But that's not the whole story. Obviously, physiology is part of the story, but there's a lot of impacts on POTS patients, on their lives, that we're not going to capture in acute physiology studies. One of the other challenges with these studies are that they tended to be done in larger tertiary care centers that had a strong research interest in POTS. And these weren't often located in someone's community. So that's not to say that no one lives in Rochester, Minnesota, but I suspect that if we were to go and poll the autonomic group at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and ask how many of their patients came from their proverbial backyard versus came from around the country or even around the world, I suspect it's a very small percentage that actually live in Rochester. And that poses its own set of issues, because the patients that are willing to travel to Rochester, especially in winter, I say that living in Calgary where it's been -20 for the better part of the last week, or who would come to Vanderbilt and spend at times a week or 10 days with us on our research unit, those patients may or may not represent the broader POTS community, right? I think you can make an argument that, we don't know for sure, but I think you can make an argument that it may well be that these patients feel more debilitated, in some way feel more sick than the average POTS patients, such that they're willing to take a big chunk of time out of their life or spend more money to travel to try and get seen for their POTS. So that's another challenge that we wanted to try and see if we can get some data around. And then the third is that the challenge with physiology studies are that they're labor intensive and they're data intensive. And so you can't study large numbers of people. It's just impossible, because the amount of effort that it took, both on the part of the investigators, but perhaps more importantly on the part of the patients, to be in the study precludes that. So for us, a 20-patient study was huge. Certainly, if you go to a clinical trialist in a hypertension study, they would laugh at that number. If you're not at 1,000, they won't roll out of bed, so to speak. So there's been a lot of good that has come out of the studies that have been done. There's a lot of important physiology and pharmacology work that still needs to be done to help us understand what's going on. But that's not going to get us all the answers that we need. So what are the gaps in knowledge? So I've alluded to this. I think there's limited data on the broader POTS community. So the majority of POTS patients have not been seen at tertiary care centers. Do they look the same as those in the tertiary care centers or not? And honestly, right now, we don't know. The studies that have been done, for the most part, haven't addressed the impact of the POTS on the patient. And impact is a broad term and can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And honestly, we mean it in all the different ways that it could be interpreted. A couple are listed here. So obviously, there's a financial impact. There's a cost to seeking treatment. There's a cost to not being able to work as productively as you might have if you weren't ill. There's a cost to not being able to attend school in a way that you might have that may alter not only your finances today, but might alter career prospects 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So there's a financial aspect both for the patient as well as their loved ones. And then there's a social cost that certainly I've heard about anecdotally, but I don't know that I've seen any data around. So how does POTS affect relationships? Boyfriend, girlfriend, husband-wife relationships, relationships with siblings, with parents, with friends. So we were hoping to try and get some numbers around that. And related to all of this, one of the challenges that Lauren had described is that when she would talk with congressmen or their offices about trying to fund more POTS research, for example, because of the horrible impact that it had on people's lives and all the money that was lost, they would come back to her and say, well, how much? And it's actually a fairly straightforward question in their world, right? They want to quantify the financial impact to say, well, we clearly need to put this much money in because our return on investment could be so much greater. But we haven't had that information, and that's part of what we wanted to try and get at, because Lauren thought it might be helpful in terms of making the case to people of influence that POTS needed more recognition, but needed more resources put towards it, both in terms of treatment as well as in terms of research. And then I've commonly heard complaints from patients about how difficult it was to get diagnosed, how difficult it was to get care. But even initially, just get a diagnosis of POTS. They've been ill, they've gone from person to person, doctor to doctor, and had problems getting a diagnosis. And we have some information in this study, but again, until recently, there wasn't a lot of data on that either. The aim of the Big POTS survey is to characterize the demographics and the clinical presentation of patients with postural tachycardia syndrome, but in the community in a cross-sectional way. So the approach that we took was really a distributed approach. So we set up a survey, and we'll get into more detail about this. But when we took the approach of sort of bringing sort of different groups of people together to try and formulate a very detailed questionnaire. And really, the distribution of the questionnaire was largely done through social media. Obviously, it wouldn't have happened without Dysautonomia International and their Facebook page, but it was set up in a way where a lot of the patients that took the survey, heard about the survey, were excited enough that they sent links to their friends. They'd sent links to other people they knew that had POTS, and got them to try and complete the survey as well. It really, I think, sort of has opened my eyes to a different model of doing some of this research, and I think has really excited some people that I've shared this model with. So just a plug, so this really, patient engagement is sort of a big buzzword nowadays in healthcare systems, right? There's a lot of, some of it may be financially driven, but it's not all financially driven, I think, but there's a sense that we need to sort of, engage patients more. But a lot of that actually boils down to asking some questions and trying to hear answers. And one of the keys to this, and I've said this already, but I don't think I can emphasize it enough, this wouldn't have happened without a ton of patient input. And the majority of that was organizationally from Dysautonomia International and people working with Dysautonomia International. It sounds like a simple thing to do. We'll create a survey and we'll put it on the web. And certainly, going in, it sort of sounded like something that we should be able to pull off. If we had a good weekend, we could put the survey together, put it out, we'll have an answer by next Thursday. The reality is this took us about 2 years iteratively to create. We'd go to our ethics board, we'll get to that in a moment, but go to our ethics board, get stuff approved, get it sent out, have a focus group, often from the patient advisory board or other people Lauren could strong arm into helping us, go through it and come back with detailed feedback, and we go back again and change it, and every time you sort of realize a whole bunch of things that didn't make sense. And the survey that we did is certainly far from perfect, but do realize, please, that this, we did iterate over and over again to try and make it as good as possible, and that wouldn't have happened without patience. Now, I'm not sure if they didn't know how to spell research properly or if that's on purpose for some reason. But not my picture, I just stole it. Okay, so the POTS survey. So the goal, as I mentioned, is to get a large cross-sectional non-referral-based population, non-referral biased population. It was done in a web-based, it was an online cross-sectional survey administered through the REDCap survey sort of database platform. The nice thing about that is that easy web access worldwide. We set up a bit.ly link, and so in theory it could be tweeted. I don't know to what extent it was, but it could be sent easily from person to person through social media. We asked patients with physician-diagnosed POTS only to fill out the survey. We then asked in the survey whether a physician had diagnosed the POTS, and a little under 10% actually didn't say yes to that. So there were some people that filled out the survey that thought they had POTS, but it wasn't physician-diagnosed yet. Nonetheless, I mean, assuming that they're telling us the truth, we can analyze that group separately and see if there are differences. This is a strength and weakness of the design. The strength is that, we can reach out to a lot of people. The weakness, though, is that in theory, we don't know who's filling out the survey. If someone wanted to, if patients wanted to, they could lie to us and not have POTS, or, and fill out the survey and say they did or make up different numbers. But I think that's at many levels, I think that is pretty unlikely. I don't know that people are that motivated to mess up the study, for one. But for those of you who completed the survey, you'll know that it wasn't a trivial task. It actually took a fair bit of time. And so I think someone would have had to be fairly dedicated to actively enter incorrect information to decrease the validity of the survey. So I think it's less likely to have happened, but it's certainly a risk that is inherent in this type of approach. So with surveys, it's easy enough to throw out a survey and put it on the web, but we wanted to actually run this sort of as a proper study for several reasons. And so we actually, as I mentioned, had run this through the Vanderbilt University Ethics Board, the Institutional Review Board, over and over again to get this set up. One of the consequences of that is that we couldn't have children complete the survey themselves. We could have parents do it for them. And that has to do with a different consenting process that's required for children under the age of 18 under U.S. law. And as part of this sort of ethics approved survey, we were able to get identified information. So people, certainly could choose not to identify themselves, but we asked that they did, and we asked the question as to whether we could recontact patients. And not everyone said yes, but a high proportion agreed. And that opens up future possibilities to look at some longitudinal data. In fact, there are some daughter surveys that need to be developed, and we'll talk about sort of some of the opportunities coming up. But again, that's a strength. So we have an initial cross-sectional survey, but we have a foundation of information where we can then go to a common group of people and ask questions over time and get a sense of what happens to them in terms of their POTS. And that addresses, I think, has a potential to address a question that we often get from patients, which is, what's going to happen? What does the future hold? And the truth is that there's really no good data on this. I think Mayo's published some one-year follow-up data, but that's really the best that's out there right now. So this has the potential to address some of these issues using a different approach. And as I mentioned, a lot of this was done by people associated with Autonomy International in terms of making the questions as good as they were. So what did we discuss, or what did we ask about? So one of the issues was getting a diagnosis. How easy was it? How difficult was it? How many doctors were seen? We went through stages of grief issues, right? I think those of us that see POTS patients in clinic, I think recognize that depending on where you catch the patient in terms of proximity to diagnosis, their needs are quite different, and their openness to different types of treatments can be quite different. And so we asked some questions around that. We did ask some questions around the social impacts of POTS. As I mentioned, Lauren was interested in financial stuff, and we certainly tried to get a handle on some of that. But in talking to patients, I mean, there are a lot of patients whose, even years later, some close family members don't believe them. And in some cases, it's led to divorce, it's led to broken relationships that were quite serious, but not quantified. We tried to address some issues around disability in POTS. A lot of these things are areas that still need to be better analyzed, to be perfectly honest. Asked questions about what types of medical tests people had on their journey to diagnosis. Asked about issues around exercise. Asked about medications they had. Asked about symptoms, as well as comorbidities, so two different issues. Wanted to know about family history. How much, one of the areas of interest for a lot of patients is this genetic? And truthfully, right now we don't know. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that the POTS gene has not been identified. But is there a subgroup that has a genetic component? It's quite possible. But we're sort of just trying on the front end of trying to understand how big a group this might be. And then we administered some structured quality of life and fatigue scores as well that need to be looked at. So we targeted a 30-minute survey, and I think some of the patient advisory board members that did our beta testing near the end were really on their game when they did the testing, because we came in close to 30 minutes. But in talking to patients who weren't on the advisory board that completed the survey, after they completed the survey, I think in many cases it took over an hour. So like I said, it took a fair bit of commitment from a lot of people to go through the survey. And there are pros and cons to that. I think it speaks to the interest in the community. It speaks to the dedication of the patients. It also, I think, makes it a little less likely that the patients would sort of hang in there for that amount of time for, if they wanted to give fraudulent data, right? That would take way too much effort, I would think, to do something that you weren't really interested in. So some of you will know that I was born and raised in Canada. Hockey is big up here. We're in the prime of hockey season. And the Big Pot survey actually came out of a candy bar that I think used to exist, I don't know if it still does, called Mr. Big. And Wayne Gretzky, arguably the best hockey player ever, was a spokesman for this. And the punchline was, when you're this big, they call you Mister. And that's actually where, what I kept thinking of every time we alluded to the Big Pot survey. This was this big, so we should call it the Mr. Big Pot survey from here on in. Okay, so sorry for my little Canadian detour. So who completed the survey? So the survey launched about a year and a half ago. It launched at the Dysautonomia patient meeting in DC in July 2015. We've closed the data set once later in 2015 for a first look, but the more recent data set close is September 30, 2016. So the word close may be misleading. The survey is still open. If you haven't completed the survey, you're still welcome to do so. But every time we want to sort of try and chunk it out and take a look at some of the data and see where we're at, we need to pick a stop point and freeze the data for analysis at that point. But I don't want people to hear close and think they can't actually continue to participate if they haven't already done so. So as of September 30th, we had a little over 4,000 people who had a physician diagnosis of postural tachycardia syndrome. We asked as one of the questions whether these patients had been seen at one of the autonomic rare disease consortium sites. And these sites, I think, were mentioned on a previous slide, but include Vanderbilt University, the Mayo Clinic, actually 2 Mayo Clinics, Rochester and Jacksonville, included NIH, included NYU, Beth Israel. I think we asked about UT Southwestern as well. And the reason we did that is that these sites represented the locations where a lot of the physiology research had happened. And so to some extent, this group was more of a traditionally verified POTS group. And this was actually to help us sort of convince ourselves to some extent that the data from the broader POTS community fit, I guess, with those that we have seen and know and recognize as having POTS because we've seen them. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of patients that completed the survey were female, over 90% in this case. And the vast majority were white or Caucasian. This actually fits quite closely with, I think, what we've seen both in the studies we did at Vanderbilt as well as, quite frankly, most POTS studies that have been published. It's a primarily Caucasian population that we end up seeing. Overall, the group was fairly well educated. So there was a mean of 14 to 15 years of education. So just in terms of how we define that, the first 12 years we counted as high school. So there's an average of 2 to 3 years of university in the patients that completed the survey. We asked when the symptoms onsetted for patients. Data is presented here, clumped in bins of 5-year windows. The peak age of onset was 14. A little under 30% actually had onset sort of in the early teens, 11 to 15, so around the time of puberty. 44, the majority of patients developed their POTS symptoms under the age of 18 or under, so in the pediatric window, but a little under half, 44%, developed their POTS symptoms after the age of 18, right? So this isn't either, it's not as simple as saying this is a disorder of adolescence or not. There's a distribution, and there's certainly people that get it at an older age, but a preponderance occurs in the teenage years. We asked about comorbidities, and some but not all are listed here. I'll linger on this slide for a few minutes so that you can look for your favorite one. The highest sort of percentage was actually migraine headaches. They came in a little over 40%. Interestingly, we've lost some of the text. Gut issues were common. Chronic fatigue was common. The important thing is the important thing is that POTS travels with other disorders. So 83% of patients reported some comorbidities, at least one. There's been a lot of interest in Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or joint hypermobility syndrome over really probably the last decade or so. It's come across as an important comorbidity for different reasons. And we saw that in about 28% of the population that completed the survey. We didn't ask about autoimmune disease as a general category. We asked about some specific disorders, but if you added up some of the specific disorders like thyroiditis that are clearly sort of autoimmune in nature, about 16% had at least one autoimmune disease. And that was actually similar to the percentage in the subgroup that also had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Right? So it wasn't an either or necessarily. There was about 16 to 18%, so in the same ballpark if you look at the overall group or just the subgroup with the Ehlers-Danlos, and the 28% with the diagnosis of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Now, it's worth noting that these numbers are estimates, and it's certainly possible that patients could have some of these comorbidities and not have been diagnosed with the comorbidities yet. Right? Patients are completing the survey to the best of their ability based on what they've been told and diagnoses they've been given. If they haven't been given the diagnosis, it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have the diagnosis. It just means they haven't been given the diagnosis. So in terms of the autoimmune comorbidity, some of the specific disorders are listed here. I know there's a fair bit of interest in this in the patient community and certainly among patients that have come to clinic that I see. Thyroiditis was number one, but there's a smattering of Sjogren's and lupus and rheumatoid arthritis as well. Right, so there's sort of a hodgepodge. It's not the majority of patients, but it's a reasonable number. Now these numbers are percentages within the autoimmune diagnosis. So if you're wondering how can there be almost 40% thyroiditis when there's only 16% overall, this number doesn't represent the overall group. It represents the percentage with the autoimmune disorders. As I mentioned, we asked about common symptoms, so not necessarily disorders, but what people complain of or present with. The most common symptom was lightheadedness. I don't think this would come as a surprise to most people. Tachycardia. By tachycardia, this is actually sort of rapid palpitation is what we're talking about, over 90%. Presyncope, common, just over 90%. Headaches, about 90%. Interestingly, the number diagnosed with migraine, a lot less. Again, I don't know if that means that there are lots of people with headaches that are non-migrainous, or if these people haven't been diagnosed and the headaches may represent, a higher proportion might represent migraine headaches. But whatever is the underlying cause, a high percentage, close to 90, have headaches. A similar number report problems with concentration. A number slightly less than that report memory problems. Again, are these truly independent and different, or are these different ways of expressing similar problems? Hard to say, but it does speak to that rubric of brain fog or cognitive problems as being an important symptom in these patients with POTS. Nausea, very common, well over 80% report nausea. Palpitation comes on this list again. Again, this actually there was more detail in the question, and this was actually more skipped beats sensation rather than rapid sensation, and that too was common, well over 80%. Shortness of breath over 80%. Muscle pains, cold feet, stomach pains, all over 80%. So again, this may or may not come as a surprise to any of you that are looking at the webinar now, because you may have these symptoms, but these are commonly described by your peers that have been physician diagnosed with POTS. What about diagnostic delay? I mean, that's certainly something that a lot of patients complain about. So we want to try and get a handle on that. And the interesting thing is there's not sort of one clean answer. I guess the simplest way to describe the data is that there's a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of variability. So some people get diagnosed fairly quickly. but there's over 25% that took over 5 years to get a diagnosis. The average was a little over 4 years at 49 months. But this standard deviation of 86, what that should tell you is that lots of variability, right? So there's some people that went much longer than, 5, 6, 7 years to get a diagnosis. And that's something that I suspect that, future efforts from Dysautonomia International and from others would be to try and better understand that. Is that just a function of geography? Is that a function of time? Are those largely people that were diagnosed a long time ago, and so when perhaps there was less recognition, and is that improving? Certainly we'd want it to improve. We need to understand that better, but there's certainly a problem still that needs to be worked on. How many doctors did it take to get a diagnosis? Again, it varied. The average was 7. Standard deviation was 8. That means there's a lot of spread in the data. And almost 25%, so I can't say over in this case, but over 20% actually saw more than 10 physicians for symptoms that they now attribute to their POTS before getting a diagnosis. So when they did get a diagnosis, the question is what type of doctor made the diagnosis? So we asked about the specialty of the doctor. I'm not sure that this is set up for audience participation. Lauren, is it?
Not this particular question. I have some other questions. We can do a poll for fun.
Okay, we'll move on then. So the vast majority actually, vast majority of times the diagnosis was made by a cardiologist. So it was a little over 40% that said cardiologist, but another 15% said cardiac electrophysiologist, which is a type of cardiologist. If you add them up, actually, it was close to 60% of the diagnoses were made by cardiologists. A little over 20% were made by neurologists. Now, I might be the only one. And in retrospect, since I was very wrong, I suspect people will tell me I was the only one that was surprised by this. I actually thought that neurologists would make the diagnosis a lot more. It probably, I suspect it has to do with the fact that palpitation and lightheadedness are such common symptoms with presentation that you end up seeing cardiologists. Heart rate is clearly an issue that if people are able to pick up orthostatics, is picked up as abnormal, and maybe that's what's driving the diagnosis. But the vast majority of the time, the diagnosis is ultimately made by cardiologists, but there's a smattering of others that are making the diagnoses. This, again, might speak to opportunities to educate and target different groups of doctors about POTS, and so maybe they can make the diagnosis sooner. Clearly, people are able to see their internist and their family doctor probably more frequently and with more ease than either cardiologists or neurologists. How about education? As I mentioned, one of the challenges is that POTS affects people, in their teenage and early adult years, and these are critical years in terms of getting the education that really determines trajectory of life, right? Determines not only what you're going to be doing now or a few years from now, but to some extent what you'll be doing 20 or 30 years from now. So what we found was startling and somewhat disturbing, I think. So 89% of patients reported that they'd missed some school because of their POTS. We don't know exactly how much, but at least some, right? So almost everyone. 28% were homeschooled, and I believe we asked the question, was this done because of your medical illness as opposed to for other reasons not dealing with health, right? So a quarter. 25% of patients had to drop out of school, and 38% had to delay part of their education, either postpone enrollment or postpone completion. They had to sort of gap out and take some time off before being able to continue their education, right? So actually fairly significant impacts that may take decades to fully, understand the impact of that. Okay, so that was a snapshot of what we've looked at so far. If you were paying attention to what we asked about, you could correctly say, but there's all this other stuff you asked about and you haven't told us about, and that's true. There's a lot of data, and we're sort of muddling through trying to make some sense of it. And there's a lot more work to be done. So some of the future priorities for future analysis are to try and assess the economic impact of POTS. As I said, this was actually something that was near and dear to Lauren's heart in terms of in the early discussions about the importance and need for a study like this. We'd like to look at the impact on relationship, look at the impact on quality of life. There have been some, the truth is there have been studies looking at quality of life. I've published some studies looking at quality of life, but again, those studies are minuscule in size compared to the scope of this. So this can actually give us sort of a much broader perspective. And it'll be interesting to see how similar or different the data from this study are compared to the studies published at Vanderbilt or at Mayo or other tertiary sites. And then we'd like to better understand, how people describe their response to different medications and supplements. And this is challenging, and we have to be careful when looking at this because we understand that patients are different. POTS isn't POTS. POTS is not one thing. It's a bunch of things, a bunch of different disorders that end up causing the tachycardia and the palpitation and these other symptoms that we call POTS. So there may well be interesting subgroups that we can see. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all thing, but we've reached out to some people who are in different fields and have different analytic techniques that may help us sort of do clustering type analyses to sort of see if certain symptoms and drugs seem to go together and groups appear, subgroups appear. What about the subgroups that are sort of more easily identified? And so we have just been doing in the last week an analysis looking at patients with POTS that have also been diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome compared to those that don't, trying to understand, are there differences in presentation? Are there different foci, things we should focus on in those groups? What about male and female patients? So while there's an overwhelming female preponderance, one of the nice things when you have relatively large studies like this is that even if males are highly underrepresented in the disorder, there may actually be enough of a population of male patients that we can say something intelligent about them. When you do studies of 20 people and one person or two people are male, you really can't do that. Does age of onset make a difference? As I mentioned, there's sort of a significant spread, but there's certainly a big population in the teenage years that develop their symptoms versus those that develop symptoms later. Are the presentations different in those groups? We don't know yet at this point, but something we have the potential to look at. And we want to try and sort of look more closely at onset triggers and see if we can get a better handle on that. I think there's a lot of hand waving around this, and I've done some of it. But this, again, the size of the study gives us the potential to put some numbers and get a sense of whether these triggers are really common and which ones in POTS patients and which ones aren't as common, but people may write about a lot. So for the future, I've talked about some of these things, but our plan when going in was to design the first cross-sectional survey with permission to recontact, specifically so that we could set up longitudinal surveys and not have people complete another full hour or more of survey, but maybe take some key elements and try and assess those over time. So it's a matter of sort of picking and choosing the key things that we want to look at. And that's something that Lauren and I have talked about. We haven't fully created those surveys yet. There have been some sort of initial discussions right at this point. And then from the beginning, we actually wanted to do sort of focused daughter surveys. So based on the answers to the initial survey, we can send more detailed focused surveys out to people with specific problems. So for example, if we wanted detailed questions on pregnancy, it doesn't make sense to throw it out there for everyone to answer, including, if half the population has not been pregnant. If we want to know what's happened during pregnancy, we can send targeted questions that would actually apply to people, as opposed to having people go through surveys that don't address issues that are of interest to them because they haven't been affected by it. And we've certainly had some, specifically we've had some contact with some mast cell people who were interested in perhaps leveraging the initial Big Pot survey for some more detailed surveys trying to understand the relationship between mast cell activation disorder and POTS. And there's certainly, lots of other things that could come out of it, and we're open to hearing suggestions from people, both patients as well as other investigators that are interested in a specific area, to see if we can work with them to leverage what I think is this very promising tool. And ultimately, I know Lauren is particularly interested in seeing if we can connect the survey data with clinical data. So I sort of mentioned that we asked of a consortium site, for example. So these are people that presumably have been seen at one of the sites that conducts a fair bit of research in autonomic disorders, including POTS. But more broadly, I know the question is, can we try and leverage EMRs and some of the data that people generate by going to their doctor and getting treatment and things like that, and whether we can harness that in some way and link it with the survey data. It sounds like, there are EMRs and the computer should all magically speak together and give us just the data we want, but it's not nearly that simple. I mean, these types of efforts would take a fair bit of infrastructure and probably a fair bit of dedicated funding to do that. But it offers a fair bit of potential, or at least there's a lot of hope with what could come from being able to link these two different forms of data collection. So I've kept you guys for a while, and I appreciate that not everyone has hung up yet. So to conclude, POTS is a disorder, from our data that confirms, I think, what we know. It's primarily seen in Caucasian females. It's associated with a lot of common comorbidities, migraines, headaches definitely, but migraines specifically, irritable bowel syndrome, the hypermobility type of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I would argue that these data, I think, are an important step to really providing a more accurate picture of what POTS in the community looks like today. And with that, we're open to questions. Actually, I think Lauren may have a spiel before we're open to questions, but we're almost open to questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Raj. And I just wanted to let everybody know who's listening that, I personally feel this way, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. We're so appreciative for this research because Dr. Raj and the other researchers at the University of Calgary and Vanderbilt University did this whole study with no funding. So they volunteered their time and their talents and their resources to do this for us, and it's really, really cool. So thank you for that. You can hear hundreds of other people saying thank you, but you can't hear them. So I have this is our first webinar, so we're still learning how to use our webinar technology, and it has a poll feature, so I want to do it to see how it turns out. So if everyone can humor me for a minute, I'm going to try to do a little poll question, and feel free to participate if you want to. So I'm just going to leave that up for a minute or two. Oh, wow, everybody's answering. Yay! 80% of you have already answered. This is kind of cool. Okay, 2 or 3 more seconds and I'm going to close it out. Okay, so now I'm wondering if it lets me see the results. Okay, so 48% of you said that you did take the Big Pot survey, and 49% said you didn't, and then 4% of you weren't sure if you took it, or you prefer not to say. I know that we have definitely had some people who were emailing me and they were like, did I take this survey already? So if you haven't, I will share the web link in the future. If you are diagnosed with POTS by a doctor, we would love for you to take this survey if you haven't already taken it. And with that, I'm going to do a couple of slides. I try not to take too much time to go over the POTS Research Fund and what we've done with that so far and what we're hoping to do in the future. And then we'll do the Q&A with Dr. Raj. And feel free to use the question tool on your webinar panel, and we'll answer as many of the questions as we can. Let me just switch over to my screen, if I can figure out how to do it. Okay, hold on. Awkward silence. I'm trying to figure out how to switch it over here. Can you see my screen now? Dr. Raj, can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay, so that means everybody can. So this is our new logo for the POTS Research Fund, and all of the different sort of layers of the colors on the right side are sort of the layers of POTS. You know, we're dealing with a complicated condition, and we sort of have to unpeel the layers to see what's underneath. And there's probably a lot of different colors underneath when you start peeling off those layers. So, so far, our very first grant funding was in December of 2013. We were really excited, even though it was super tiny little grants. It was $4,000 grants. And you can't really do much research with $4,000, but we wanted to you know, help support research that was going on and sort of encourage some new research. So these are the projects that we funded in 2013. One is a study Dr. Raj was doing at Vanderbilt, and I think that's still going on, right? Dr. Raj?
Not too late to sign up.
You have to find out.
People are interested. We're still recruiting. Not for long, but still recruiting.
Still recruiting. And Dr. Shamali had, since not everyone likes using pharmacological treatment, you know, we have a lot of patients who feel much more comfortable using lifestyle or natural therapies. So we did think it was important to study something like that. So Dr. Shamali is actually an expert in using music therapy in neurological disorders. And it sounds kind of like it's not a real thing, you know, but it actually is. There's a lot of really cool research, and he's looking to see if we can reduce the heart rate in POTS patients by sort of timing your heart rate to certain types of music. That's still recruiting, if anyone's interested. You have to do 2 tilt studies for that study, so that's why not everyone is jumping on board to do it, but he's definitely recruiting. Dr. Blichstein at SUNY Buffalo did a pretty cool paper on markers of autoimmunity in POTS that already published. And she found these were just patients that had come to her clinic who had existing autoimmune diagnoses already or different autoimmune markers. And it showed that this was, you know, a pretty good subset of patients had these different markers with and without a formal autoimmune diagnosis. And then the last study was a sort of very technical study Dr. Stewart in New York was doing on cerebral blood flow and nitric oxide in POTS patients, and that also has published. And you know, these studies we sort of supported, but I think they all had some additional funding. Okay, great. I couldn't figure out how to go to the next slide. Our first conference study grant, as some of you or most of you probably know, we do a research study at our conference every year starting in 2014. And the first one was led by Dr. Raj when he was at Vanderbilt. And he sent our serum samples to Dr. Kem at the University of Oklahoma. And we screened POTS patients for adrenergic receptor autoantibodies. And this photo is the line of patients outside the door of the research room. You've never seen so many POTS patients smiling about to get their blood drawn. They were so happy. to be part of a pretty neat research project. And then as a bonus, we sent split samples of, had a little extra serum. So we sent it to Dr. Vernino at UT Southwestern to screen for the ganglionic acetylcholine receptor antibodies. And so his poster, he did a research abstract poster at a conference. It confirmed that a very small percentage of POTS patients have these antibodies, but they have it pretty much in the same amount of antibody as seen in the healthy population. So he concluded that POTS patients who have these antibodies probably don't have POTS because of the antibody, and that there must be some other mechanism causing their POTS. Dr. Raj can speak to the adrenergic receptor antibody project if he wants to, but it's not published yet, so I know he's not going to say much. Want to give us a few words? Can you hear me?
There have been challenges. Yeah, so there have been a lot of challenges. I will tell you that when we did the study, I certainly didn't expect to still be working on this now. So the issue boils down to a few things. So when we did the study, we'd had a small number of patients at that point that we had samples on, right? So we had a few patients from Vanderbilt, a few patients from Oklahoma, some control subjects split between them. But in total, in that paper, that sort of led to a fair bit of follow-on work. There were 14 patients studied, and so part of the goal of this study at the patient meeting was to try and get a larger population of patients to try and see how important these are, right? So nothing, I really don't believe that there's going to be anything that we're going to find that causes 100% of POTS. I think most of us that have seen a lot of patients recognize that there is a lot of heterogeneity, and I expect the same thing in terms of pathophysiologic mechanisms like these antibodies. So the part of the goal of the project was obviously the patients are interested in what the answer is, but part of the interest was to see if we could actually leverage this to develop a technique that could be done going forward. In the original paper for the alpha adrenergic antibody assays, these were all functional assays, right? So let me take a step back, because I think there are a lot of people that have looked into this and have sent their blood. I've heard from people that have said they've sent their blood off to Germany to a lab to look at alpha and beta antibodies, and they're positive, negative, they're positive in a certain number. But those antibody assays are using a technique called ELISA, and basically what it's telling you is that there is a fragment that another antibody is bound to, right? So it tells you there's something there. What it doesn't tell you is whether that something is doing anything or not, right? And we all have lots of antibodies in us. The question of interest to us is, are these antibodies actually functionally significant? Are they potentially contributing to the symptoms and the presentation that we see in POTS patients? And so in the first go-around that led to that first paper, the David Kem's lab used an artery-based assay. So they used a physiologic assay where they took a piece of tissue and stretched it out, and then added things to it to show that it can contract or relax, and then went to see what, if you added patient serum to it or a fraction of the patient serum to it, if that altered it. And it did actually in all 14 cases. And that's where the data came from. But that is a very labor-intensive and costly assay that could never actually be used, could never be ramped up to be used clinically. And so the Chem lab has been working, for the beta receptor, they actually have an assay that's worked, and those that participate in the study have actually received results from that. But where we've struggled is the Chem lab has sort of gone through about 5 or 6 iterations now to try and come up with an approach that is reliable to give us an idea of alpha receptor function. And I think we're getting closer. I really do. This isn't something that we have ignored. I mean, we've sort of had meetings with them as recently as last month for sort of the next approach, and I think things are getting closer. I've learned early in this process not to promise a time because, we've been wrong before.
Hey, Dr.
But
Raj, I just,
if this,
oh, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt your thought.
no, I was just going to say that, it's been a work in progress. The idea, my not saying a lot about it isn't because I'm trying to withhold data until we get some magical publication. It's because we've actually been working and developing this assay. When I say we, largely the Chem group in Oklahoma, and we're getting closer. But it's been a big heroic effort.
So what I wanted to say is, you said that the beta receptor assay results were sent to the patients, but I don't think that's correct. I think what you might be thinking of is the Vernino ganglionic acetylcholine receptor assay results were sent to patients, but I don't think the patients got the beta results, because I didn't get mine.
No, so you're right. So I think we sent some results. It was probably Vernino's because those were the cleanest ones. Yeah, so we're still working on it. The betas are closer. The betas are closer. Right now. I'll be in touch.
Okay. I didn't want anybody getting like hundreds of emails from people saying I didn't get my results. So what was sent out was the Vernino results probably over a year ago now, and we're waiting for the other chem-based results. Sort of the really simple way I've explained what their lab is trying to do is, it's not like a test that you can send off to LabCorp and it already exists and they just sort of run the test and send you the results. They're actually trying to invent the test. So it's a lot of trial and error, and they really, really want to make sure that the test is accurate before they send us the results and before they sort of announce that they've found something in POTS. So I know, it's frustrating as a patient, you want your results, but at the same time, we did this because we're trying to support the research and get the right answers, not just any answer. So anyways, let me move on to the next project. I keep hitting my arrow key, but I have to click the screen. So the next thing that we funded was a 3-year fellowship and funding support to do this lab work at the University of Oklahoma. That's a photo of Dr. Kem, and that's actually not the research fellow. That's his grandson, who is on his way to medical school and spent some time in his lab learning about POTS and POTS research on his way. So we're hoping maybe he'll end up being a new POTS doctor somewhere, because we certainly need more.
So his grandson's actually the one that did the first assays that I said were really difficult to do. He actually did those assays as a summer student in his lab a few years back.
Yeah. So and this fellowship was named after the daughter of the family that gave the very generous funding. It was a pretty big grant, and we're very grateful for that. And that's ongoing. It's a 3-year project. It's still in the works, and we're all waiting for the results. The next project was at our 2015 conference, and Dr. Singer from Mayo Clinic screened for the Mayo's autoimmune dysautonomia panel, which is already commercially available, but they also screened for a couple other antibodies that are not part of the official panel, and some thyroid-related antibodies. And then after they screen for those sort of known antibodies, they're going to do a technique which I'm probably going to describe incorrectly, but basically like a broad brush search for neural receptor antibodies using immunofluorescence. Sort of like the way Dr. Singer described it to a couple of patients was like, if you took a bunch of neurological tissue from different parts of the body and you put it in a blender, and then you added a bunch of patient serum that had some dye on it, and you'd see what the patient serum binds to, then you maybe could find some new receptors that the serum is binding to. So it's kind of not a very accurate way of describing what they're really doing, but it's kind of neat. It's like a 2-stage process, and I believe they already did the autoimmune dysautonomia panel and thyroid results, but they're I think they're waiting for the results on the panel. The autoimmune dysautonomia panel is normally very expensive and time-consuming, and Dr. Lennon's lab at Mayo Clinic has given us a very deep discount because she was excited to do some antibody research in POTS. So we're also waiting for those results. The next project we funded was with Dr. Freeman at Harvard, who is looking at vasomotor neuropathy in POTS. And some of you may know Dr. Freeman is a pretty noted expert in small fiber neuropathies and diagnostic techniques to identify small fiber neuropathies. So the vasomotor nerves are the nerves that run along or inside your blood vessels. And he sent me this kind of neat photo. The yellowish kind of stain is the blood vessel. The red stain is some of the autonomic nerve fibers. And the blue stain is collagen. So kind of those of you with EDS might be thinking, that kind of makes sense. And Dr. Freeman had actually said he was sort of interested in figuring out how the collagen structure and the small fiber nerves are all connected. And what's not shown on this slide is actually there are mast cells right next to all of this stuff. So a lot of our overlapping problems are all sort of geographically located next to each other in the body. So we need some new research to try to figure out, what's going on in us. And I say us because I'm a POTS patient too. So the next project was a grant to Dr. Kem just to buy some additional testing equipment. This is not his actual equipment. I'm sure his is a lot less cool looking than this, but this is just something I pulled off the web. He's doing a lot of antibody assays with big trays and running them over and over again, and he needed a little additional equipment funding. So the next project was a conference study in 2016 with Dr. Bernino. That was this past summer. He screened for muscarinic receptor antibodies in POTS. These are sort of like, I don't know, Dr. Raj, is this a good analogy? Sort of like the parasympathetic nervous system version of the antibodies that you and Dr. Kem are focusing on, roughly.
Sure.
Okay. And so he had done a small preliminary study and came to our conference to collect from I think it was about 160 patients, and also waiting for the results on that. It's sort of what I say to almost everything is we're waiting for results, but eventually we know that these investments in research are going to pan out to some answers. Not sure what the answers will be, but we're certainly excited to find out. So what's coming in the future for the Big POTS study? We've funded $408,000 since December 2013, but we are really trying to kick the fundraising into high gear to raise more for research. And as a relatively young organization, being able to fund that much research in the past few years is actually a lot. We've talked to bigger, older nonprofits like the MS Society and the Sjogren's Syndrome Foundation, and they've said to us, wow, it took us 10 years before we were funding that much research. So we're pretty excited, and we know that that's because of the enthusiasm from the patient community and our donors and our volunteers who get out there in their communities. So thank you if you've been part of that at all. We really, really do appreciate it. So this spring, we're hoping to fund at least $200,000 in research grants, and we've already raised $142K, and you might have seen us on Facebook sort of nagging everyone and pushing out the fundraising requests to raise an additional $58,000 by New Year's. We bought a new website domain that just redirects to our main website because dysautonomiainternational.org is really long to remember. So we just bought curepots.org if you want to send that website out to any friends or family who might be willing to donate. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to skip. And so when we do have this pool of funding put together, we will put out a request for proposal to all researchers from any country. And really our three priority topics that we're interested in for this round of funding would be genetic studies, autoimmunity and immune dysfunction, which would include, immune dysfunction would include mast cell stuff too, and then new treatment approaches. Because I think of the genetics and the autoimmunity stuff as forward-looking, finding treatments in the future that can be tailored. But right now, we still have a lot of patients who need better treatment than they currently have. So we want to kind of go on both tracks at once, future-looking and addressing the current situation. Also, we have our conference coming up next July. It's in DC again. We haven't opened registration or announced a specific date, but that will be soon. And the researchers have been, POTS researchers have been invited to present research ideas for this coming conference, and the applications are due later this week. So would the researchers do more POTS research if they had more funding? Yes, they definitely would. Just in the past year, we have received, without even putting out a big request for proposals, we've received over $2 million in grant proposals. And every single one that comes in, I get pretty excited about, and I want to fund it. But, realistically, we can't fund, unless somebody wants to bankroll this type of research, we can't fund $2 million in funding right now. But we think that, maybe in a few years we'll keep growing and that will be possible. The types of grants that we're giving out now are sort of, I kind of view them as like entry level or proof of concept grants. For a researcher like someone like Dr. Raj or somebody at Mayo or Harvard or wherever to go to the National Institutes of Health, or now Dr. Raj is in Canada, so they have the Canadian version of the NIH, which I don't know what it's called. What's it called?
The poor, kinder cousin is the Canadian Institutes of Health Research.
Okay, so, but to go to these government agencies and say, I need $3 million for a POTS study, they're not going to give you $3 million until you've already proven with some preliminary data that your idea is worthy. So I think of a lot of these studies as a sort of proof of concept level funding, where you can get just enough patients to prove something is a real idea or not. And then if it is a real idea, then you can go to the NIH or the Canadian NIH and sort of bump up the funding request to something bigger. And the first time that happened was actually David Kem. He got, based on some of the preliminary research that we helped fund, he did get a pretty nice sized grant from the NIH to continue doing his antibody research, which I think is important to point out is probably not just specific to POTS. He initially had reported on these antibodies in orthostatic hypotension, and prior research has connected some of these antibodies to other dysautonomia-related conditions, like the muscarinic receptor antibodies are somewhat associated with Sjogren's and Chagas disease, which is pretty rare in the U.S. But it's not just POTS. Even though we focus our research funding on POTS, I do think a lot of this has sort of tangential benefits to other forms of dysautonomia. So, I just have a list here of the different types of studies that the researchers have proposed. It's really varied, and it's great to see new ideas coming in. And personally, I think we really need to sort of look at genetics, because we know this runs in families so often. And I get asked all the time, is my kid going to have this? And I don't have a good answer. I don't know. But I think we need to start looking at that type of research, which is very expensive. So how can you help? Well, obviously, if you can donate, that would be great. asking your friends and family to donate, especially around the holiday season. I know I've asked my friends and family to just, don't get me a Christmas present, donate a little bit to the POTS Research Fund instead. You can host a fundraiser, and we have a lot of tools that can help you do that. Online fundraisers where you don't actually have to leave the house, on CrowdRise, or in-person events. If you email us at info@dysautonomiainternational.org, we're always happy to work with you to help set up an event in your area. If you haven't already taken the big POTS survey, that's the link. We will email it out after the webinar too, in case anyone hasn't already taken it. That's meant for people who've been diagnosed with POTS by a doctor. And then, volunteer for other POTS or dysautonomia related research when you can. If you're at one of the autonomic centers, or if you see something online, it's a lot of studies, take a long time to recruit patients for. So we can help speed up the pace of research if more of us volunteer for research. And then, of course, the really easy way to help is just go to medical school. Come on, you've so many patients that I know have sort of been through many medical school just because they've been sick so long, and they end up knowing so much about this. But those are just some of the different ways. So now we're going to take some questions, and you might think this is Fry from, oh gosh, can't remember the cartoon show now. But anyways, this is actually Dr. Raj when we're asking him like a million questions at once right now. So I'm going to just take some questions. We have so many questions people have submitted, and I probably can't get to all of them. I'm going to try to take the ones that are, maybe widely interesting or easy to answer. So these questions are for you, Dr. Raj. Have you seen people that have a mild form of POTS and then they have a trigger where their symptoms get worse?
Sure. I think there's a lot of variability in how people present, and I'd say overall my sense is that over time people learn to function better, and I think in many cases when I follow them they are somewhat better, so they improve over time, but that's certainly not true of everyone. But even in those people, which I think is less dramatic than what the questioner is asking, the course of improvement is not linear, right? If you were to sort of go from point A to point B, people talk about the shortest distance being a straight line to improvement, but that's honestly, I'm not sure I ever see that. There's a lot of ups and downs, and when people get sick, and that's certainly, like a viral infection, the types, I'm not sure if that's what's being referred to as trigger, but that's certainly sometimes described as what triggered episodes. I think it's actually almost predictable that patients will get worse. It's a little like the old game of snakes and ladders. You sort of fight to some improvement, and you get sick, and you fall back. Then you have to fight your way up again, and the hope is the overall trend is upward. So absolutely, I think people sort of have a bad infection or something else happens. They can certainly become much more symptomatic and much worse, and it's going to climb again to get back to functioning better.
Yeah. So the next question is from a patient who asks, can stomach problems be related to POTS?
Well, I think one of the things that was in one of the earlier slides was that there are a lot of gut complaints seen in POTS, and certainly nausea was a common complaint. I think in over 80% of the people that completed the survey. From my clinical experience, I'd say there are two types of gut problems that we see in varying degrees of frequency. Bowel problems, so stuff within the spectrum of irritable bowel syndrome as a co-diagnosis is incredibly common. I've seen a few patients that are sort of very, very constipated. I'd say diarrhea predominance, I think, is more common in the patients I see than constipation, but I'd say that's a high percentage, the majority of patients, I think, have some sort of coincidental or comorbid gut issues. But that's more intestinal stuff, so that's associated with abdominal cramping and sort of irregularity of bowel movements. What's less common, but I think more debilitating when it occurs, are symptoms that are more like gastroparesis. So these are patients that have more stomach-type problems. When they eat, they may be chronically nauseated, but when they eat, the nausea becomes unbearable to the point where, in some cases, people aren't able to eat, aren't able to keep enough nutrition down to maintain their weight, to maintain, good sustenance. That's not as common. I mean, I think I'd estimate I'd see that certainly in a minority of patients. It's not, in the never seen category, but it's a fairly small minority. But those patients, I think, are more severely affected, and certainly we do see that in some POTS patients.
I want to
speak to the heterogeneity of POTS.
I want to do our second poll question, and that can sort of help us understand a little bit more about our audience. So I'm just going to leave it up for 5 or 10 seconds because I want to get through as many questions as we can here. So try to answer quickly. You guys are fast. 75% of people have voted, so I'm going to close it out, and I'll tell you the answers. I don't know if can everyone see the answers? I'm not sure. But the answers are, how long have you or your loved one been diagnosed with POTS? 47% of our audience members have been diagnosed for 2 years or less, 20% more than 2 years, 21% more than 5 years, and 9% more than 10 years. So I'm not sure if that just means that older people aren't on the internet as much, but that's a big question in POTS is, what percentage of people get better, and does it differ by age or by gender? I think we're just starting to see that kind of data come out, but it isn't really very clear yet. So I know it's a source of frustration for patients not to have really good answers on that. And the reason I did this is because one of the questions for Dr. Raj was, what percentage of pediatric POTS patients get better?
That's a great question.
The question was, what percentage of pediatric POTS patients get better?
So, I mean, I think honestly, I don't think there's a good answer to that question. And it also depends on what gets better means. In the adult world, and I'll come to kids in a moment, but I have more direct experience in adult patients. I don't think that I've seen an adult POTS patient, certainly, of the ones that came to see us at Vanderbilt and spent time on our inpatient unit, who, to my knowledge, was cured. And by cured, I mean, doesn't worry about it, doesn't think about it, isn't treated for it. It's just, something happened, it was there for a while, it had to be chronic to get diagnosed, and then poof, they did X, A, B, and C, and it went away, never to be heard from again. Now, that's not to say that we didn't have a lot of patients that got better. I mean, we had a lot of patients that function at a very high level, or do now. We have patients that are doctors, patients that are lawyers, patients, that are able to function, but it's with treatment, be it exercise, be it, drugs, even things as simple as, paying attention to what they do and not pushing beyond certain boundaries. And people can function quite well. In the pediatric, there's a little literature, but it's not great literature. There's not great data, but some saying that, a lot of these patients get better. But again, I'm not sure what they mean. I mean, it may be that they get well enough that they're not coming back to clinic anymore. But I'm not sure if they get totally cured. But again, cure is nice, but cure is not necessarily the be-all and end-all. What we really want, I think, in everyone, but especially in our adolescent patients, is to allow them to function again, right? Allow them to get back to school and do well in school and be productive and and not sort of be bedridden and not be able to sort of do anything. So I think for the latter, I think we could do a pretty good job, or we have the potential to do a pretty good job in terms of, they can modify, what they do, pay attention to sort of taking in enough salt and water and getting exercise and sort of focusing on the prize. And a high percentage, I think, can get better in terms of function. I don't know how many can say it totally goes away. I mean, I think it's more likely in kids than in adults because there's a lot of growth and other changes, but there's not good data around it right now, Lauren.
So here's another question. I know you have an answer to this on a different slide that you often include in your POTS talks, but it wasn't in this one. What's the relationship between POTS and ADHD, if any?
So one of the challenges, so actually I'm not sure I know the answer. You might have to actually give the answer. But what I will say is that anxiety disorders, for example, can present with palpitation and tachycardia and other symptoms that overlap with POTS. And so I think there's sort of an overlap of presentation anyway. And I think that's part of the explanation for why, patients express frustration that they go to their doctor and it's written off as a psychiatric issue or anxiety. And there may be lots of different reasons behind it, but I think part of it is that some of the manifestations are similar. And that actually is a problem even when you use structured tools to assess that. ADHD and POTS have, some clinical overlap, right? I mean, one of the more disabling symptoms in POTS is actually the whole issue of brain fog and all its different manifestations. In one of the early studies that was done at Vanderbilt looking at sort of psychiatric phenotypes in POTS, one of the only things that actually came out in that first study was sort of problems with attention. But these were tools actually designed for ADHD studies. And so the end manifestation can be similar. The interesting thing when they looked at it, though, is one of the tools actually asked the question about now and then when you were a child. And the pattern was actually very different in ADHD and POTS patients, right? So POTS patients have described attention problems, that were really a more recent thing and didn't have problems. I'm not sure when in childhood they were asking about, but didn't have problems back when they were young, while the ADHD patients actually describe problems dating back to when they were very young. So I don't think they're the same disorder by any means, but they certainly share similar manifestations. And there's certainly patients that have tried to resort to ADHD type treatments to try and help them get through some of the POTS symptoms.
So here's a question about the Big POTS survey. So this person was diagnosed with EDS after she took the survey, and she wants to know, is there a way she'll be able to let us know that, and will we sort of re-ask those kind of questions on a follow-up survey? So I think just a quick answer on that is yes, but you tell me if we're going to do that.
So I think it would be an interesting thing to ask about in follow-up surveys. And as I mentioned, these are still works in progress. And I think it's a great idea. I'm not sure I would have thought to ask about sort of changes specifically to some of the comorbidities. I think it would be tough right now to go back into the original survey and correct answers, so to speak. And in fact, I'm not sure that we want to, because at the time it was done, the answer was no. But it's certainly something I think we should include in a follow-up survey.
So try to give shorter answers so we can get through a lot of these. Are chest pains common in POTS?
Yes.
So here's another survey-related question. Could the percentage of patients diagnosed with autoimmune disease or other comorbidities be smaller than it really is because the people haven't been diagnosed? This person is saying that she took, years to get diagnosed with her autoimmune disease after the POTS diagnosis. I would say that we sort of know that going into the survey, that a lot of these things are tricky and hard to diagnose, like EDS. Patients often have a lot of diagnostic delay, autoimmunity. I believe in the comorbidities chart, it was a fairly small percentage of patients who reported having small fiber neuropathy, but we know from research studies at a couple of different autonomic labs that roughly 50% of POTS patients have a small fiber neuropathy. So what probably happened there is that that patients aren't really being screened for it that often. And that did show up elsewhere in our data when we asked about the different types of autonomic testing. So I guess I answered the question. Sorry, Dr. Raj. But yes, we know that the comorbidities are just what patients have currently been diagnosed with, and that some of them, they could be misdiagnosed with things and they could be underdiagnosed with things. Let's see, the next question. Do you think POTS is new, or do you think that it's been around for a long time?
Been around.
Can you explain why orthostatic hypotension is excluded from the POTS diagnosis?
Sure, but I need more than 2 words.
Okay.
So if someone were to have a GI bleed and lose a lot of fluid, at some point you would get, you would drop your blood pressure, and before you drop a line down, you get orthostatic hypotension. And part of the physiologic adaptation to the drop in pressure, if your baroreceptors are working, is to get tachycardia, right? And so the orthostatic tachycardia in that case is a direct result of the underlying problem causing orthostatic hypotension. Similarly, in some patients, with neuropathy causes of orthostatic hypotension, I see it a lot in diabetics, probably because we see them at an earlier stage than some of the other disorders. They can actually get tachycardia with their orthostatic hypotension as a response. So that's not what we're describing when we're describing this thing that we call POTS, right? So we're trying to, there's a diagnosis for people with orthostatic hypotension. It's orthostatic hypotension, and there are different sort of manifestations and ways of organizing that. So what we're saying here is there's this disorder where the pressure is not dropping, but there's still something else abnormal. In fact, the tachycardia, I think, is more likely to be missed if you don't emphasize this, right? Because people, I think, don't measure orthostatic vitals to begin with, and when they do, often you'll get just blood pressure. And so I think it's important to sort of point out that there are these disorders where the heart rate rises ridiculously high, to levels ridiculously high without drops in blood pressure. So there's already diagnosis. It's not saying if you have orthostatic hypotension, there's nothing wrong with you, but we call it something else, and we have approaches to it and different classifications for it. So that's not to say if you ever have orthostatic hypotension, you can't have POTS. The point is that if the heart rate only goes up in response to the low blood pressure, then that's a physiologic increase, right? If you have orthostatic tachycardia lots of times with, a preserved blood pressure, and occasionally your blood pressure tanks and goes down, then you can still have POTS. The point is you can get manifestations of the excessive tachycardia without the drop in pressure. That help?
Okay, here's $1 million question. Why do POTS patients have low blood volume?
Don't know, and not everyone does. When we were doing this at Vanderbilt, again, this comes back to the heterogeneity of this thing we call POTS. There are different ways of getting there. But a few people had very low blood volume, and a lot of people had a little bit low blood volume. So one of the areas of research interest that we had for several years was looking at issues around the renin-angiotensin system, right? So this is an important hormonal system in the body that does lots of different things, but one of them is regulation of salt retention by the kidney, and then also blood vessel tone. And both a group at Vanderbilt and Julian Stewart's group in New York, who you mentioned in one of your earlier slides, have shown that at least in some of these patients, the hormonal responses can be funny. Now, these are tough things to study because you have to control salt intake and other drugs and all that, so it's not an easy thing to do clinically. But there may be problems where that response isn't perfectly normal. And the answer is not known, but I'll just put in one more plug. Yeah, so one of the things that David Kim is working on, he has different antibodies of interest, but he's actually been looking at some antibodies to basically the receptor that angiotensin 2 works on to produce aldosterone. So the receptor that's integral in this part of the hormonal system. And some patients may well have antibodies to that cause some downregulation, right, where they're not producing as much aldosterone as they need and maybe not retaining as much sodium. But there's a lot of smoke and bits of stuff pointing to problems there in some people, but there's not a clean answer.
Okay. So here's
so it's at least a $1.95 question.
So here's a question I'll try to give a quick answer to. What's the difference between orthostatic intolerance and POTS and dysautonomia? So dysautonomia itself is just a really broad term that just means dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system. POTS is just one form of that, and orthostatic intolerance is, POTS is a form of chronic orthostatic intolerance, which is actually one of the older names for it. But orthostatic intolerance is sort of like another umbrella condition that really that you could include any kind of disorder where the person has trouble standing up because of their blood flow. So if you have, lightheadedness when you stand up and it doesn't fit the POTS criteria, sometimes a doctor will diagnose it as orthostatic intolerance. Sort of falls within that same area, but they're not necessarily all different things. They're just sort of different ways of describing the same thing. And there's other forms of dysautonomia and other forms of orthostatic intolerance. So hopefully I haven't thoroughly confused everyone with that. Here's a quick one, Dr. Raj. Can POTS lead to congestive heart failure?
No, not that I know of. But you have to be careful. So one of the POTS patients usually have structurally normal hearts. But if you have early heart failure, you can actually present with orthostatic tachycardia and palpitation and shortness of breath and some of the other symptoms that POTS patients have due to a cardiomyopathy. So I was once referred a patient who developed POTS late in pregnancy, supposedly. And when she came to see me, the problem wasn't that she developed POTS. The problem is she developed a cardiomyopathy related to the pregnancy that can sometimes happen, and she had these other manifestations, but she had a different underlying problem.
Okay.
But I don't think the other way is true. I don't think if you have POTS for 5 years, you're going to develop heart failure.
So are viruses a possible trigger?
I think so. Again, that's where I think that's sort of the impetus for a lot of the antibody work. I don't know that anyone can say definitively, but there are different sort of onsets or different presentations that people describe, and one of them that's described, I think, in a significant minority, not the majority, but a reasonable number of patients, is that I was well and then I got sick, and they can tell you the date. I mean, I had one person that was willing to tell me to the minute when she got sick. She was at a picnic and she got horribly sick with what sounded like this sort of flu bug, some sort of viral infection, and she never got better. So that history suggests that viruses may trigger it, and it may be an autoantibody mechanism. But that's the work that's still being done.
Yeah. So are there efforts to teach other medical professionals about POTS, and are we releasing the Big POTS survey results in medical journals?
Yes, it's the first question. So I think there are efforts. It's not an easy thing. A lot of it is a slow one-by-one progress. And I will say that sometimes the most effective teachers aren't people like me, but it's patients like those of you here who are watching tonight. I think, you can be a great source of education for your doctor if your doctor's sort of interested. I think Lauren was saying that, she's heard numerous stories of patients that, have been ultimately been diagnosed and go and sort of educate their doctors a little, and then their doctors think about it and they find another 5 or 6 patients in their practice that have had symptoms that they never twigged that this was what it was, and they go back and in many cases they do actually meet criteria for POTS. So the physician education is a slow. There's not a magic bullet. There's not a quick thing that can be done where it'll magically happen. But we've made some efforts, both through the Autonomic Society and I think at the meeting 2 years ago, there's a CME session for non-autonomic physicians that were interested in POTS to learn a bit more about it. There was something similar that was linked to the American Autonomic Society meeting this year. Tom Chalimsky, who's in Milwaukee, I know runs a few sessions a year around the country for different physicians, so there are efforts at that level for sure. In terms of the Big POTS survey, absolutely the plan is to publish it in medical journals. So far we've had some, we presented it at a couple of scientific meetings for other doctors to share the results with other doctors. But we're really, it's at the, it's the tip of the iceberg type thing. It's sort of the first sort of cuts of the data and big picture stuff. And there's a lot more. Lauren has worked with us to submit some more abstracts to the Heart Rhythm Society meeting. We had a deadline just last week. But the next phase is probably in the American Academy of Neurology. So the answer is yes. So far it's been abstract presentations, but that's a time issue. Certainly part of this strategy is absolutely to write this up and publish it in peer-reviewed scientific journals where other people can read it, but also we can point people to these data and they can be cited and used for different purposes, both publication but also perhaps for advocacy, when that's appropriate.
I'm also hoping that when we are done publishing the initial findings, or when we're done publishing everything we can sort of pull out of this, it might require some additional ethics approval and maybe going back to the patients to ask for permission. I'm not sure, but I would really like to take de-identified patient data, meaning your research data, but not attaching your name or your contact info or anything like that to your data, and then making that data available to other researchers so that they can look through it, because there's just a mountain of information here. And I think part of Dysautonomia International's goal, we want to support the existing POTS researchers, but we also want to encourage new people to come into this field, because we could use, a couple hundred more researchers thinking about this, and we still probably wouldn't have enough research to go as fast as we want to. So I think this Big POTS study is really, it's going to set some pretty cool infrastructure, I think, to advance POTS research as a whole. And I wanted to add to the, regarding the efforts to educate medical professionals, Dysautonomia International has hosted and co-hosted and co-sponsored a whole bunch of different physician and patient education programs around the U.S. Since our launch, and we continue to do more and more. The more we can fundraise, the more physician education we can do. These events are typically on the really cheap end, maybe $3,000. On the more expensive end, about $10,000 per event. So the more we can fundraise, the more events we can do. Sometimes people get in touch with us and they have a contact at their local hospital or medical school and they want us to help them set something up, and we're usually able to do that. So if any of you listening to this have contacts, especially at teaching hospitals, we'd really love to connect with you if you have a contact that can get an invite to, send us an invite to host a lecture, not just on POTS. Usually when we do physician education, the speakers usually give a sort of a broader overview of autonomic disorders, because to understand POTS, you really do have to sort of know about the other autonomic disorders too. So yeah, if you have any contacts at hospitals that can really, legitimately set something up, we can ask, like Dr. Raj is doing a lecture with me in Indiana in April, and Dr. Sandroni from Mayo Clinic is doing one in, I want to say in June at the University of Pittsburgh. So there's a bunch of things like this going on. Next question. Is there any POTS research being done at the NIH?
Is that for me or you, Lauren?
Well, I can answer it, but it's for you. Milner, and that's it.
Not a lot, not directly, right? So David Goldstein has done stuff in the past. He's been explicitly forbidden, I believe, to work on that. His focus is on Parkinson's, MSA, and Parkinsonian disorders like that have autonomic failure. I guess I don't know if, Lauren, you want to touch on the Milner paper that you're excited about. It was stuff focused on tryptase deficiency and enzyme deficiency that may link, it's an allergic response and may link to some patients with mast cell activation disorder. And so some POTS patients, I think, were in that study, although I don't think it was a POTS study. But I'll let Lauren speak more about that.
Well, now that you've just explained it, Dr. Josh Milner is an immunology sort of genetics researcher at the NIH, and he's interested in the genetics of allergic disorders. So he started seeing people who had this mast cell kind of presentation, but they didn't all have POTS. Some of them had neuropsychiatric diseases, some of them had chronic pain conditions with or without a dysautonomia, some of them had other forms of dysautonomia, and some of them had POTS. And what he found was that they had some of these patients had a duplication of the alpha tryptase gene. And tryptase is a substance that's involved in mast cell reactions, and I mean, it's in everyone. Everyone has tryptase, but some people have higher than normal baseline tryptase, and that's what he found, is that some people have this, and it seems to correlate to having duplicate copies of the alpha tryptase gene. So, I've spoken to him. I was on the phone earlier today with Dr. Afrin talking about that very same project, and we don't know what overall percentage of POTS patients have this genetic. I wouldn't call it a mutation, because I've heard some patients say that. I have the Milner mutation or something. It's not a mutation, it's just multiple copies of a gene. And we really have no idea what percentage of POTS patients have this, but we know that a lot of POTS patients don't have excessive tryptase, and that's baseline tryptase. So like when you're not having an allergic reaction, is your tryptase elevated to begin with? So that's what Milner's genetic finding was linked to. So there is talk of maybe doing this at the conference this year or funding it as a future study. We haven't made any decisions yet, but we want to know the answer. What percentage of POTS patients have this duplication error, whether it's 1% or 12% or 40%, we don't know. But we'd like to know, because whatever percentage of patients that is, that gives them a biomarker that's real, that helps them validate that their diagnosis is a real thing, because we know that so many of our patients are dealing with doctors at home that don't believe them or don't think they're really sick. So anything we can do to sort of confirm that this is real, we're going to do it. All right. Next question, why do POTS patients have light sensitivity?
I don't know that. So I think I put this in the category that some patients do and some don't. Light sensitivity is certainly very tightly linked to migraines. And so my first question would be, do these patients have migraines with it? As we saw in the survey, that's actually a pretty common comorbidity, and I'd probably ascribe it to the migraines.
Okay. What are your thoughts on IV saline, and why does IV saline make us feel so much better than drinking loads of water and salt?
So I think IV saline makes you feel so much better than drinking loads of water and salt. So I mean, there's pretty good data that acutely IV saline will lower heart rate, and this probably feeds back to the blood volume issues that Lauren asked about earlier, where certainly when we were formally assessing this at Vanderbilt, I mean, a high percentage of the POTS patients that we studied had varying degrees of low blood volume. And IV saline acutely can fix that. It's not a good long-term fix because your body gets rid of it, but it acutely sort of plumps up the blood vessels. So why is that better than the drinking? It probably is. It's you're putting it straight into the bloodstream. So if this were a drug, we'd say it's 100% bioavailable, as opposed to most drugs you take in the gut. I mean, some percentage of it eventually gets into the bloodstream, and it's probably a similar sort of issue, right? But you're pumping up the vessels. So acutely, I think it's a great treatment. So if someone is feeling miserable, my advice, is if you're miserable enough and you end up in the emergency room, the pattern is often repeated, where you feel horrible, you go in, you get lots of tests, it comes back normal, and then you're sort of stuck. What do you do now? And do you get admitted or not? And usually my recommendation would be to see if they can give you a couple of liters of saline before they decide to admit you. Because in many cases, I think, the saline can make you feel well enough that you can go home. The problem is chronically, right? So the problem is that is getting it in you over time is difficult through regular intravenous catheters. And so if you keep doing it over and over again, you start blowing all your peripheral veins, and eventually you need to go to a central line. And these are therapies that have risk, not the least of which is that you're chronically breaking the barrier to the outside world, the bacteria and other infections. The skin is critically important in keeping that out. And if you put a long-term catheter in, it's like a superhighway for bacteria. Even in people that are really, really careful, it's usually a matter of time before they get infected. There are other serious complications that can occur as well, but the most common concern is infection. So, I'm not a big fan of chronic IV saline, people getting it over and over again because of the access problems. But I think if someone is sort of doing poorly, it's a good rescue type medicine, if you will.
So a quick question I just wanted to answer. Someone asked if we do physician education courses in Canada. We definitely would if we got asked to host at any hospitals. And I know Dr. Raj has done some lectures at University of Calgary since he's arrived back there. This is where he came from initially. And I'm guessing that maybe you've done elsewhere. I know that if we had a hospital in Canada that was going to help us find an audience of doctors, we would definitely either send Dr. Raj or maybe somebody from Mayo to speak. So yes. Here's another question. Exercise is said to help people who have POTS, but it's really, really hard for us to exercise without feeling worse the next day. How are we supposed to do this? It's a really hard question for Dr. Raj to answer, and I think for any patient, but it's a good question.
Yeah, so I mean, what the data shows, what the data is reported and what's published is what happens over time, right? So in people that sort of stuck with an exercise program that was nominally listed as 3 months, but in terms of practical application and the way it was done, it probably took sort of 3 to 5 months. And people that completed that program felt better eventually. The truth, I mean, I think both things that are said are probably true, right? That exercise is supposed to make you better eventually, but in the short term, you feel miserable and often feel worse. So there are a couple of things, in talking to different people involved in the studies, that were noted but not necessarily sort of published in the papers in terms of the practical, sort of the how-to part of the exercise. One is that the benefit that people, people talk about exercise making you feel better and all those things, but the benefits, the people that describe the benefits didn't have that right away. It often took 4, 5, 6 weeks before you noticed any improvement. The second part of that is that in that initial period, in that first month, there is a good chance that you will feel worse, just as was described in the question, right? That it sort of wipes you out. People have described it different ways, but with similar flavors. But I can't get out of bed for 2 days is a description that I've heard from different people. So early on, it takes its toll until there's sort of some aerobic reconditioning can take hold. So initially, you will feel. I think you should expect to feel worse going into it. There is light at the end of the tunnel, but it's an article of faith to some extent. You have to hang in there for a while before you see any benefit. And I think longer than most people, with or without POTS, would under normal circumstances. What I can tell you is this isn't just data, though. I mean, I've had patients that have done this that swear by exercise as a part of their treatment. I'm not sure it's the be-all and end-all. I've had a few patients that have weaned off drugs. A lot are still on drugs, but they function better with the exercise, and they know when they can't do it for a few days for whatever reason, that they notice a difference.
Someone's asking, what exercise programs do you recommend for POTS? And I just wanted to mention that on the Dysautonomia International website, we have a whole page about exercise for dysautonomia patients. Of course, we always recommend that patients check with their doctor first before engaging in any sort of new vigorous exercise. But we have the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia modified version of the Levine protocol. This is what Dr. Boris from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia put together that he thinks is a little bit more realistic and doable for the average pediatric POTS patient he was seeing. And if you stick with it, it seems to work just as good as the Levine protocol, although we don't have any research data saying that. But my answer when patients ask me is, do what you can do and always just push yourself just a little bit. And if you start really slow and really gradually build up over time, I think you would surprise yourselves. I was totally bedridden for 2 years before I was properly diagnosed. And I did the Levine protocol. I thought I was going to die for the first few weeks of it, but I did it and I didn't die. And it helped a little bit. For me, it wasn't the be-all end-all, but it was still important that I did it. And I think a lot of people feel that way. And it turns out I ended up having an autoimmune disease. But even my autoimmune disease doctors say, exercise is really important to manage autoimmune disease. So I exercise every day, even though I seem to be consumed by Dysautonomia International stuff. It's really hard, though. It's not easy. If it was easy, we wouldn't think of it as exercise. So that's my little rant on exercise to add to what you said. So another patient wants to know what type of testing a POTS patient should have to rule out underlying causes. That's kind of another big question. And it's already 10:02, so we should probably let you go after this question.
So it's a tough question because I think people want to know if there is something else causing it. The problem is you don't want to put people through a gazillion tests because that has its own problems, both cost in terms of money, but also cost in terms of risks and something. If you do 20 tests, one is bound to be positive by chance. Usually, I'm fairly conservative with initial tests. Make sure there's no anemia, make sure the electrolytes are okay, make sure potassium is not being wasted, sometimes indicate kidney problems. We'll sometimes get autonomic tests. We have the facility to do that, and that can give us an idea of if there's a problem with the ability to squish vessels and things like that. But then after that, a lot of it is based on if things present that make you wonder about other things. So Lauren, I hope she doesn't mind me saying, she's mentioned the autoimmunity a few times. was diagnosed with Sjogren's syndrome and describes, issues with dry mouth and dry eyes and other things that may make one wonder about Sjogren's. So I think if there are things in your particular history or your presentation that make someone think about other disorders, I think it's reasonable to go after that. But I wouldn't recommend a shotgun of, do these 120 tests to rule out all these other disorders. I think there's a lot of harm that can come from that.
Okay. What do you suggest as the most, this is my last question, sorry, as the most useful, what do you see the most benefit from in terms of POTS treatment, pharma or non-pharma? What is the sort of thing that works the best for the most number of patients?
Should toss it to you, Lauren. You talk to more patients, I guess. I mean, I think it varies so much, and I don't think it's for the most part for me, it's not a pharma or non-pharma approach. I mean, I think everyone should be doing non-pharma things with or without the drugs, depending on how symptomatic they are. I actually find that I've had some patients that feel a lot better with just salt and water, but usually by the time I see them, I usually shotgun if they're not already on higher dietary salt and water. We'll do that. Compression stockings work in some people really well, and others absolutely hate it. I think but again, I've had people get through, medical students get through surgery rotations, where they're basically, for those that haven't sort of seen this on TV, basically it's 8 hours of standing, retracting, relatively still, right? A really stressful thing for someone, with orthostatic intolerance, with compression stockings. Doesn't work on everyone, but I think it's worth trying. If you can tolerate it and you feel better, then it's gold. And then then it depends on what the main problem is after those things. But I start there in almost everyone. And then if rapid palpitation, like when people try and get up and just walk around the house or go out, their heart races and they feel lightheaded and they can't function, then I think taking the edge off the heart rate with a little bit of propranolol seems to work very well for us. I know some people think it's a crazy thing to do, but I have patients that have given me the Charlton Heston line about you'll pry the propranolol from my cold dead hand. So I think it's a reasonable place to start if that's the problem. But if really fast tachycardia is not the problem, then the propranolol may be less helpful. So it's a tough thing to answer because there's not an answer for everyone, but salt and water for everyone to start.
The good news is we did ask this question in the Big Pot survey, and it's towards the end of the question, so we haven't finished analyzing the data yet. But we will have the answer from a couple thousand patients summarized on what the treatment is that helped them the most. I do remember from reading the data that learning to pace yourself is actually something that a lot of people consider to be a really important coping mechanism. When to push and when to rest. And nobody can really tell you that. You have to sort of figure that out yourself over time. I think it takes a while to sort of get used to having POTS, which is, not the answer anyone wants to hear. Nobody wants to get used to it. But once you do get used to it, you can sort of balance your when you push and when you rest and get a little better at it. So I promised someone I would ask this very important question because it comes up on the POTS support groups all the time, and it's always very controversial. So last question, Dr. Raj, is POTS fatal?
No. Did you want more than a word, or was that?
Well, I'm sure I don't need more than that, but I'm sure other people would love to hear a little bit of an explanation on that, because I think it's a normal thing for newly diagnosed patients to worry about or wonder about and ask. So I would never try to discourage someone from asking the question, but I sort of want our patient community as a whole to know the answer to this so that when we see newly diagnosed patients, we can help give them the right answer.
Yeah, so I think the answer is no. I mean, we know POTS patients that have been around for a long time, and manifestations may change, but we don't think it's fatal. We don't think it. One of the concerns is with all these heartbeats, am I going to wear my heart out? Am I going to have a heart attack sooner? you know, the answer is we don't think so, right? I mean, if, you know, certainly it's not that you're going to have a heart attack at 35. You know, if, you know, it's not that it's going to protect you from a heart attack when you're in your 60s or 70s, depending on what else you're doing. But the short answer is we don't think so. It's associated with a lot of morbidity, right? There's no question that people feel horrible. It affects their life tremendously.
Hey, can you
But
explain morbidity? Because that sounds like a lot of people don't know what
right,
morbidity means.
right. So morbidity is just what I was trying to say, that it's associated with a lot of miserableness, right? It's associated with a lot of functional limitation. It's associated with lots of other symptoms that can cause lots of problems. Basically, POTS patients can feel absolutely miserable, right? It's not that it's a disorder that, you know, it's not going to kill you, don't worry about it. It clearly is something that, you know, is affecting people in a big way. And that's, again, that was part of the rationale for doing, you know, some of the questions in the POTS survey, was trying to get a sense of quantifying how it impacts the patient community. But to the best of our knowledge, it doesn't kill people, right? And it's a manifestation of a bunch of symptoms. It doesn't kill.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Raj, and thank you for everyone who has stayed with us throughout the webinar. This will be available on our Autonomic Disorders video library, which is our Vimeo page. Just maybe take a day or two to figure out how to download it and upload it to Vimeo. And we're going to have these webinars monthly with different experts, so please join us again. The next one is January 12th with Dr. Boris from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. We have one in March lined up with Dr. Cook, February lined up. What did I say? Dr. Boris is January 12th. Dr. Cook is the end of February around Rare Disease Day. We're going to talk about rare forms of dysautonomia. So I think that's it. We're going to sign off. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on Facebook.
Thank you all for listening.